US President Donald Trump is marking the first 100 days of his administration. During his campaign, he promised to overhaul free trade deals and protect American jobs.
So, how has President Trump measured up? Earlier, I spoke to Charles Hankla, an Associate Professor of Political Science at Georgia State University.
I think the country does remain quite divided about how well President Trump has done in his first 100 days. But I do think that looking empirically at the record, I think that you can start to sense that among his populist base, there is beginning to be a little bit of disappointment that President Trump has not been able to do more and not been able to fulfill more of the promises that he made during the campaign.
OK, but let's look to Wall Street. Those pundits there are saying the Trump effect has helped Wall Street rally almost double digits.
What has driven that? I imagine, and I think most commentators would argue that it has to do with the hopes for deregulation of the financial sector. And also of the corporate sector. And President Trump has followed through on a number of those areas because for many of them, he doesn't actually need Congress. He can do it with his executive powers. So one of the most important changes that he's made since becoming president is using executive orders for the purposes of deregulation. So I think that gave a boost to the financial sector. But I do think that that honeymoon is over.
We saw on his first few days in office, he pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of which Australia was party to. He's since, though, oscillated on a number of other trade issues, particularly on NAFTA and deals with Europe.
Absolutely, yeah. So, of course, during the campaign, as I'm sure you and your viewers know, Donald Trump had a very America-first approach to trade policy, which you could translate as being quite a protectionist approach to trade policy. And he promised that he would pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is this agreement that includes Australia and basically 12 Pacific Rim nations. And he promised that he would pull out of or possibly renegotiate NAFTA. And as one of the first things that he did after becoming president, as you know, was actually pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But since then, it appears that his trade policy has become a little bit more traditionally conservative and a little bit less populist. So after that initial move of pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the president's appointee for chief trade negotiator did indicate that the United States continued to be open to the TTIP agreement with Europe. The president did back off of plans to eliminate the Import-Export Bank, the Exim Bank. And so a number of the president's policies have started to look essentially a little bit more traditionally pro-free trade, which has traditionally been the Republican position. However, there is also some evidence in the last week or so. It's very hard to keep track of President Trump's policies. In the past week or so, we've seen some vacillation on that. So the president, it was first reported, I think, 2 or 3 days ago, that the White House was preparing a memo that would have withdrawn the United States from the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, which would have been hugely significant for all three economies. But then, after pleas from the president of Mexico and the prime minister of Canada, President Trump has said that he just wants to renegotiate the agreement. So we're going to have to wait and see exactly what the terms of that renegotiation might be.
Now, Charles, in the past week, we've also heard his policy on tax, some huge changes there, cutting many of those industry tax rates and taking it down to 15% in some cases. What's been the reaction of that, and is it likely to indeed even get through?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Yes. So the president has promised, enormous tax cuts, the biggest tax cuts ever. And the proposal that he's put forward, it's still fairly vague, so we don't know all of the details. But it would cut the tax brackets down from 7 down to 3. Overall, what the tax plan would do is it might benefit some lower income people, depending on their circumstances, especially if they are moved down from a 20% to a 15% tax bracket. Others, depending on where they lie within that previous tax bracket, could actually be bumped up. So the effect on middle income and lower income Americans is somewhat ambiguous and will depend. On upper income Americans, it's likely to be very beneficial. because of the lowering of the highest rate and because of the elimination of the alternate minimum tax and the estate tax. In terms of corporations, that's where the biggest cut is. And so, as you mentioned, President Trump would cut the corporate tax rate down to 15%. Republicans have been pushing for this for some time because the U.S. corporate tax rate actually turns out to be relatively high compared to other countries. And there's a hope that this will keep corporations inside the United States. But I think that, on the other hand, there is a danger that many people, wealthy people, professionals, business people, lawyers, consultants, will actually file for corporate status in order to lower their taxes down to 15%, which is another issue. So all in all, I would say in terms of the tax cuts, there would be significant tax cuts. It seems fairly likely that this will, very likely, in fact, that this will increase the budget deficit and the national debt. Despite the assurances that it will stimulate enough economic growth to compensate for the cuts. So what it appears is that the president is willing to increase the national debt and the deficit in order to have lower taxes, which he hopes will stimulate the economy.
Which I guess might make it hard for some of those big infrastructure spend projects to get through if he's relying more and more on the budget there. Can I ask you, in conclusion there, Charles, has he delivered on his promise of great economic change?
I think overall, what he's been able to accomplish in the first 100 days has been fairly limited. Part of that is because he hasn't gotten his people in place very quickly, and there's been a very steep learning curve. Part of that, I think, is because he's run into obstacles in Congress. We know that he tried to repeal Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and was unable to do it. There's opposition to this tax plan in Congress, even from Republicans. And so I think on the economic front, what President Trump has been able to do primarily has been through executive action, which most importantly pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then some of the deregulatory policies. But I think that in the long run, this is going to be problematic for him politically, because when you actually look at what he's done, a lot of it is of a more traditional pro-business conservative sort of economic policy, rather than the populism that got him elected, but from working class people. Trade policy might be a partial exception to that, but tax policy very much in the vein of traditional Republican ideas.
Charles Hankla, Associate Professor of Political Science at Georgia State University. Many thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.